2024 NFL season is here. What's going on, football fans and my fantasy freaks? Welcome to your Week 1 Fantasy Football starts and sits. I'm excited, guys. I'm pumped. The NFL season is finally here, and I'm here to help you get started with your fantasy season, picking up a W. If that sounds good, Gronk, spike the like button. Don't forget to comment any lineup decisions that you may have. If you want my advice or just my opinion on something, let me know in the comment section below, and I'll definitely make sure that I comment and reply to as many as possible. Before we get started, guys, I know that redrafts and fantasy leagues are over and done with, but that doesn't mean that fantasy football season is over. There's still the excitement of daily fantasy football. And the place where I'm playing daily fantasy football every week, starting with week 1, out with a bang, baby, is OwnersBox, of course. And OwnersBox is running a fantastic offer for week 1. On Sunday, September the 8th, all you have to do is join the main contest, $250K main contest, and you get a free $5 ticket for any contest for the rest of the season. Sounds good to me. There's $2 million in prizes for the first month of September. So join now because there's only 1,000 free tickets on OwnersBox. Check it out, guys. I'll see you there. Before we get started with my week 1 NFL starts and sits for fantasy football, make sure to subscribe for the weekly advice here on the channel. But the most important thing I can say is start your studs. If you drafted a player in the first 6 rounds of your fantasy draft, you should be playing that player. You should be playing Christian McCaffrey in week 1. You should be playing Puka Nacua. You should be playing Jalen Waddle. You should be playing George Kittle. You should be playing even guys like James Cook. You should be playing all of these players. If you drafted them high in the draft, you should be playing these players. The players that I'll actually be discussing on a weekly basis are players that may or may not like your lineups. And in this video, I'll give you 4 players to start, 4 players to sit at every position, and give you the reason why. So let's begin with the quarterback position with our quarterback starts of week 1. Jordan Love is my first start of the 2024 NFL season. That's a shout out to Sandy, by the way. He takes on the Philadelphia Eagles on a Friday night, which I think is going to be a shootout on Friday night. I can see a lot of points with 2 new defensive coordinators for both sides and many new pieces on the Eagles defense specifically. The Eagles defense was absolutely putrid last season and finished the year as the 30th defense in football, meaning the 3rd worst defense in the NFL in points allowed. They were also 31st versus the pass and 31st in plays conceded. So Jordan Love has a fantastic opportunity to live up to that contract in a primetime setting right away, and I think he puts up 3 touchdowns in this game. So I would start Jordan Love. CJ Stroud. CJ's probably a quarterback that you're going to start anyways, but just in case you're in maybe a slimmer league, I included him on the starts and sits. There's a lot of anticipation for CJ Stroud this year, and he gets a perfect matchup in week 1 to live up to the hype, just like Jordan Love. It's meant for them. Stroud takes on the Colts, a team that he's already played twice in his NFL career, a defensive coordinator in Gus Bradley that he already knows, despite only being a rookie last year, very well. He threw for 324 yards on average in the 2 games, 2 touchdowns on average, and a 114 passer rating in the 2 games. He tore them up in that final matchup before the playoffs, and Stroud gets to face a really bad secondary with all his weapons intact and healthy in week 1. The guy could go for 400 yards, and I wouldn't be surprised. Tua versus the Jags is my 3rd start of the week at quarterback. Tua plays Jacksonville, a defense that was 26th in yards allowed last year through the air and 28th in attempts faced, which also means that teams decided to throw on them rather than run on them. Now, I do think Jacksonville's defense will get better as the season goes, but I think week 1 is a tricky matchup for any defense against Miami because Mike McDaniel is a wizard, and he will come out this season with many different things to offer a defense. Tyreek Hill is always his fastest and quickest in week 1, and I expect this offense to put up points at home in warm weather. It's a perfect environment for Tua and even Trevor Lawrence to have big passing days and a lot of points being scored. My fourth and final start at quarterback, if you need a sleeper or a pickup, is Geno Smith versus the Denver Broncos. One of the worst defenses in football last year. The Denver Broncos, 27th in points allowed, 28th in passing touchdowns conceded, and 26th in net yards per attempt. Geno has all his weapons. Kenneth Walker in the backfield, Noah Fant at tight end, which we may or may not be discussing later, Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf, and Jackson Smith-Njigba. Geno, I think, looked good in the preseason. I think he has a point to prove in week 1. I think he's genuinely underrated. The game will be nice in Seattle, and they are 6-point favorites. I'm also intrigued by the upside of seeing a new scheme and a new offense revealed to the NFL in week 1. So I would start Geno if I need a quarterback, or maybe I'm in a 2 QB league. I'd definitely start Geno Smith. My QB sits, Dak Prescott versus the Cleveland Browns. Cleveland was arguably the best defense in the NFL last year. They had 18 interceptions on the season from a pass defense perspective, and they allowed the second least amount of passing yards. The other question about this is that Dallas has a new offensive line. Tyron Smith is not starting at left tackle. It's actually a rookie taking on Myles Garrett in his first ever game, the defensive player of the year. So good luck, Dak, staying upright. Secondly, the Browns are healthy on defense. They have a great secondary, and it's also in Cleveland, not in a dome for Dak, where the Cowboys are a much better offense in general. So I think it's just a complete fade on Dak in week 1. Kirk Cousins versus the Pittsburgh Steelers is my second sit. I'm very high on Pittsburgh's defense this year. I think they might be the best defense in the league. This game is in Atlanta, and it's in a dome, which is nice. At least it's not in Pittsburgh. But I will say that Cousins is coming off an Achilles. Cousins is learning a new system to some degree, and Cousins is having to mold and mesh with new weapons. So I just don't love that his first matchup is coming against TJ Watt, Minkah Fitzpatrick, and Patrick Queen. It's just not a great matchup. They were 11th best first quarterbacks and 6th in points allowed last year. Justin Herbert versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Justin Herbert does not really know who his receivers are outside of Josh Palmer, so that's a little bit of a troublesome point. The Raiders probably will have more fans in that Charger Stadium than the Chargers, so it might not even be a home game. And Herbert's been injured the entire offseason and training camp, so he just enters the year with a bunch of reasons to not be optimistic, and the Raiders are a good defense. They were actually 12th best against quarterbacks last year. My fourth and final sit at quarterback is Jaden Daniels versus the Tampa Bay Bucks. The Bucks have been excellent against rushing quarterbacks over the last few years under Todd Bowles. They do a great job of disguising and sending elaborate blitzes at these rushing quarterbacks, like Jalen Hurts, for example, in the playoffs last year. Daniels will have a handful with the different angles of approach from Todd Bowles on third down. I think he's going to be very confused, and I don't really foresee Washington on the road with a bad offensive line traveling particularly well in this game. I think that Tampa's also good against rushing quarterbacks. They were 5th best at allowing the 5th least amount of rushing yards to quarterbacks last year. My running back starts. Very important position to get right. In week 1, you always want to go with the guys that are probably most projected to get volume over the upside plays. That's just my opinion. You kind of want to go with floor in week 1 over ceiling in week 1. That's just my opinion. James Conner versus the Bills. Conner is probably mostly looked at as a low-end RB1 or a, high-end RB2, depending on your build of your team. Some leagues, he might even be a flex, depending on, again, the build and the size of your league. But James Conner faces a Bills defense that's 28th in yards per attempt in 2023 on the ground. They're typically not the most powerful defensive line and great at stopping the run. They're a little bit slimmer and smaller up front, and there's no Matt Milano to call the defense this season early, which is going to cause some function, let's say. James Conner was also excellent when Kyler Murray was healthy last year. And when James Conner is healthy, he's been highly efficient with these Cardinals. I actually think this is the most underrated rushing attack in the NFL. I think Conner has a huge day, and I wouldn't be shocked if he finished as a top 5 running back on the week. Zamir White versus the Chargers. I trust Zamir White to see a lot of action against the Chargers. This should be a low-scoring defensive game. As I said with my Justin Herbert sit, Zamir White should see about 20 carries in this game against the Chargers defense that allowed the 8th most fantasy points to running backs last year. Start the workhorse. Najee Harris versus the Atlanta Falcons. There's no fancy stat for this one because the Falcons were actually pretty good against the run last year, if not very good. But with Jaylen Warren being banged up, I expect Najee to get a lot of work in this game. And I think he's going to be a lot better for fantasy than a lot of people think. Arthur Smith will feature him in their game plan, both through the air and on the ground. And I could see Najee, if the Steelers score a touchdown in this game, scoring the touchdown. So they're going to have to rely on the run game because of how kind of dysfunctional their quarterback play looked in the preseason. So I expect Najee to get a lot of work in this game with Warren banged up. Raheem Mostert versus Jacksonville. I'm starting Raheem here because if I drafted him with the expectation that he's going to be probably the guy that's getting the most work early in the year, while A-Shane could be the guy that gets the work down the stretch, right? So I kind of am forcing my hand by drafting him to start him early. But that being said, I think he is a good start. Jacksonville allowed the most receptions to running backs in 2023. So with Tua probably airing it out in this game, I could see Mostert catching like 3 or 4 passes, some nice swing out screens and things like that to get him yards after catch and get him going. Mostert's also a touchdown monster, so he could score 1 or 2 touchdowns in a high scoring affair. Running back sits. DeAndre Swift is not going to have a Swift debut against the Tennessee Titans. 6th best against running backs last year were the Titans. They added one of the best run defending linebackers in football, Ernest Jones. I think the Titans are going to play the Bears a lot closer than a lot of people expect. And I also think that Khalil Herbert is going to have a bigger role than people expect as well, which means that we're not even certain Swift is going to be the main ball carrier in this offense, which is scary to start in week 1. Brian Robinson against the Bucs. What I know about the Bucs and Todd Bowles is that they're just always good against the run. Last year, they were 5th best against running backs. It's just a good idea to not fade the Bucs run defense unless they're kind of banged up. With Vita Vea in the middle and Levante David at linebacker, it's a tough scene against a pretty bad offensive line. So I would sit Brian Robinson. He doesn't have a lot of upside in this matchup. Gus Edwards against the Raiders. I could see J.K. Dobbins getting the start, which scares me. So if you need Edwards as like an RB2 or a flex, I would fade him. I'd probably go with a more high upside wide receiver option, potentially at flex, or, probably more a different running back option, let's just say. But I would say with Gus Edwards, the Raiders have, I think, low-key really improved their run defense. When you think about their defensive line, they now have arguably the best run-stopping edge player in Max Crosby and the best run-stopping D tackle in Christian Wilkins. I think both are in the top 3 at their position for that duty, right? So Wilkins really helps them against a run, but John Jenkins is also a good player at D tackle against the run. So I think the Raiders are going to be a very tough team to run on this year. So I would sit Gus Edwards. J.K. Dobbins, I think, would be the better start here for more upside, but I also feel like he's not a good start either, just given the kind of unrecognizable carry share in this backfield. Cincinnati running backs against the Patriots are my final running back sit. New England was very good against the run last year. They were actually one of the best in success rate and EPA allowed, but they were 4th best at allowing the 4th least amount of rushing yards last season to running backs. Cincinnati is another one like the Chargers, where we don't really know who's going to be the primary guy. Like Zach Moss, probably grinder in between the tackles, 1st and 2nd down, Chase Brown 3rd down. That's kind of the expectation. If I had to start one of them, I guess I would start Zach Moss just for the opportunity in the 4th quarter for them to run the clock out. But I just don't think either of them against this defense have a very high upside. My wide receiver starts. I got some exciting names here. Let's start with Christian Watson to pair up with Jordan Love in week 1 in a shootout game against the Eagles. Watson was one of my favorites all offseason, is one of my favorite football players that, I have covered in recent seasons because of the success I've had with videos about him on my channel. But Christian Watson is not just bias here. What I love about this matchup is Watson is facing an Eagles secondary that allowed the most fantasy points in 2023 to receivers and the most receptions. So the Eagles were putrid against wide receivers last year. But what I also like from a Watson perspective is that he is very fast and explosive. He's fully healthy with his hamstrings. And the Eagles are very slow on defense. Well, that's kind of why I feel like Watson will not be covered one-on-one in this game. So I think he's going to provide a lot of problems here. Josh Palmer against the Raiders. Palmer has been good against the Raiders in recent history. In December, he had 4 catches for 113 yards and a touchdown. So if you need a flex or a wide receiver 3, a sneaky option would be Josh Palmer against the Raiders. He also is the guy that, with Herbert missing a lot of action in the preseason, he has a lot of chemistry with him. He has the most inherent chemistry. So Palmer seems like a pretty solid floor play for your fantasy team in week 1. T. Higgins against the Patriots. T. Higgins, as a Patriots fan myself, wearing a Bengals jersey, I think that the Bengals are going to move the ball and score, even against a good Patriots defense. T. Higgins was the most successful receiver against the Patriots the last time they played. In 2022, T. Higgins had 8 catches for 128 yards and a touchdown. The reason why I think this is probable is not only could Jamar Chase miss week 1, which would raise his ceiling immensely, but even if Jamar Chase plays, Christian Gonzalez will likely be tracking Jamar Chase, at least when he's on the outside. And if Higgins is, let's say, not getting the shadow of Christian Gonzalez, the young stud corner, Higgins will likely draw one of the short Patriot perimeter corners, Jonathan Jones or Marcus Jones. He mossed Marcus Jones continuously in 2022, and Jonathan Jones is not much bigger, so it's just a good matchup for T. Higgins from a physical standpoint. Chris Godwin is my 4th and final wide receiver start. He plays the Commanders. The Commanders were putrid on defense last year, but even worse against receivers. 2nd worst against receivers, and they allowed the most yards to receivers. What I love about Godwin is that he's going to be playing in the slot more this season, making his floor very achievable each and every week and making his consistency pretty darn awesome for fantasy. Baker, I think, will have a very nice day here at home, comfortable, and the guy that he'll be going to regularly early on is Chris Godwin against an overmatched and underskilled Washington nickel corner. My wide receiver sits. Surprisingly, I'm going to go with Brandon Ayuk here against the Jets as kind of like my bigger name to sit. He's probably going to take on Sauce Gardner, who in my opinion is like by far the best corner in the NFL. So I would not really want to face a corner like that coming off a period of time where he wasn't practicing very much. So if you have Brandon Ayuk, I'd probably still start him if I'm being honest in the leagues that I'm in, being competitive. But honestly, like, I would just temper my expectations. I would have a plan for the rest of my roster to have maybe more achievable upside or, potential to boom, because there is potential here where Ayuk could bust. Just given the matchups on the Niners, the Niners just have so many good skill players that they don't need to force feed Brandon Ayuk, right? So with the matchup being Sauce Gardner for a majority, or maybe even DJ Reed, who's also very good, Debo could get fed from the slot a lot. That wouldn't surprise me. McCaffrey could get fed a lot in the backfield, and George Kittle. So they don't really need to force feed Brandon Ayuk in this game. Mike Williams versus the 49ers. The biggest reason I would not start Mike Williams is the injury, and that he's probably going to be very slow coming back from this major ACL injury, but also he's taking on a Niners secondary that's pretty darn underrated, and also like a really good pass defense from a pass rushing standpoint. They were also sneaky good against receivers last year, sneaky good in interceptions. They led the NFL in interceptions last year. This is Aaron Rodgers' first game in like 2 years, basically. He played like 5 snaps last year. So it's going to be a little rough, I think, for Rodgers on the road in a primetime Monday night setting where Nick Bosa is going to be like on fire. And what I don't like about Mike as well is just his stature and size against this Niners secondary that's mostly built on physicality and size. Like Charvarius Ward and these other corners are all like 6 foot plus. They've got long arms and they've got the length to match Mike Williams on the perimeter. Brandon Cooks versus the Browns. Cooks has been dealing with nagging injuries all offseason, but he also draws a really difficult CB2 matchup. CeeDee Lamb will largely probably have Denzel Ward on him, or maybe a little bit of Greg Newsome when he's in the slot. But Brandon Cooks will largely just be running straight lines against Martin Emerson, who's one of the best second corners in the NFL. And the Browns were also really good against receivers last year, third best against receivers. So given the injuries in the offseason, the age of Cooks, the potential downfall of his play, and then also the matchup, I just think he is not in a good spot here to succeed. Rome Odunze against the Titans, I would sit him. I think the Titans are a very underrated secondary. You have Keenan Allen and DJ Moore that are both playing, and they're in the lineup. So given Shane Waldron and his confusing usage of receivers, especially young receivers, we could see a JSN-like approach from Waldron like last year where he was in Seattle as the offensive coordinator and not really use Odunze as much as you would expect. I would also say that Tennessee has 3 good corners. So no matter where Odunze lines up, he's probably still not going to be really drawing an easy matchup, right? They've got L'Jarius Sneed. So if he's playing X, that's going to be like a terrible matchup. If he's playing in the slot, which he probably won't, he'll be taking on Roger McCreary. That will largely be Keenan Allen's role. And if he's playing wide receiver 2, let's say like Z, he'll be taking Chidobe Awuzie, who's also like a really solid corner. So I just think either way, this is a good secondary, a tough defense. It's a weird vibe. We don't really know the splits, the usage of this young player. So I would just stay away in week 1. My tight end starts. So for the tight end position, we're only going 3 each because the tight end position is very thin. So there's just not 4 guys on a weekly basis I can list. But David Njoku against Dallas. Dallas was actually decent against tight ends last year, but call this a feeling of Dallas has really bad linebackers. I don't foresee them being able to shut down one of the most athletic, gifted tight ends in football who finished last season, like over the last 10 weeks of the year, as the best tight end in fantasy. Like he was ridiculous. So if Njoku continues where he left off, he could be an absolute superstar in this game. And given that Deshaun Watson is really rusty and pretty damn bad, like they might just throw him the ball on screens and like get the ball in the hands of their best yak player early in this game and let him go to work. So he's a guy that I think could have a big boom game, but also like a decent floor as well. Hunter Henry is a sneaky little start this week if you need a tight end versus Cincinnati. Cincinnati allowed the 4th most fantasy points per game last year to tight ends. This is an offense that comes from the Cleveland Browns that loves to feature their tight ends like we just discussed with David Njoku. And also the Bengals allowed the most receptions to tight ends last year. Hunter Henry is maybe the most talented receiver on the Patriots. He's certainly the most experienced, and that could come in handy from a veteran quarterback perspective in Jacoby Brissett in a game that they'll largely be trailing for a majority where they'll have to pass the ball. So Hunter Henry probably will catch like 5 or 6 passes here. Noah Fant versus the Denver Broncos. I like this one just because it's his former team, and the Seahawks allowed the most yards and the most touchdowns the Broncos. Fant's on the Seahawks, okay? The Broncos allowed the most yards and most touchdowns to tight ends last year. And who knows, right? It's his former team. It's week 1. You don't have Kobe Parkinson or Will Dissly there anymore in Seattle. So Fant's going to be playing a lot more snaps. He could start a breakout season with a boom in week 1 if you're looking for an upside play. And my tight end sits. Dalton Schultz against the Colts. Too many targets on the Texans offense. And the Colts are best in the middle of their defense. They have good linebackers. Julian Blackmon's a good safety. I don't think that's the area to target the Colts. I think it's at the corner position. It's at wide receiver. When you look at Stephon Diggs, Nico Collins has torched the Colts in the past, and you got Tank Dell. Those guys are going to get and draw all the targets. Dalton Schultz is probably going to largely be a block and release type player in this game. I don't see a huge upside for him here unless he scores a touchdown. Cole Kmet versus the Titans. Again, same sort of thing, like too many targets. But the scary thing about Kmet is that Gerald Everett has been playing just as many snaps as Cole Kmet this, offseason or this training camp, this preseason. Like Everett has become a thing for Shane Waldron, and he has confusing usage that held Noah Fant back in Seattle last year. So I kind of just would not want to play any Bears, secondary option. I'd play DJ Moore. I'd maybe consider playing Keenan Allen, but not Kmet or Rome Odunze, given just the amount of targets that are out there for them. And then Ferguson against the Browns. This is kind of a shocking sit. You probably have to start him because you drafted him as a top 8 tight end, but I don't love the matchup this week. It's definitely more of a floor play. The Browns allowed the least amount of yards to tight ends last year, so they were just an amazing defense. I would just hinder my expectations. I would definitely temper them, so I feel like Ferguson still be fine to start over a lot of other names, but I'd just consider the matchup. And in terms of defenses, there's 3 defenses I like to stream this week if you're going that route, or you drafted your defense last or second last and you're looking for a defense out there, or you don't love the matchup of your defense this week. I like the Bengals against the Patriots. It's the worst offense in the NFL in my opinion. Terrible left tackle. I think they're going to get a lot of sacks in this game. The Bengals, potentially a couple turnovers. Jacoby Brissett looked awful in the training camp and preseason. I think that Drake May is the better quarterback and he's on the bench. Seattle against the Broncos. The game's in Seattle against a rookie quarterback in week 1. They're 6-point favorites, and Seattle has Mike McDonald on their sideline. So I feel like McDonald is going to bring a new energy to this defense and a new scheme. And the Saints against Carolina. The Saints completely shut down Bryce Young last season. I would expect very much the same. I would expect a defensive game from the Panthers and the Saints. Saints defense at home is usually pretty good, especially in week 1 where the energy and the crowd will be very much in it in the Superdome. So those are my starts and sits for week number 1 of the 2024 NFL season. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, Gronk spike the like button. Don't forget to let me know any advice you need for week 1. We'll see you next week. Don't forget to subscribe for more starts and sits every week on OwnersBox Fantasy. Deuces.